The title of the morning session is Lessons Learned from Research. So our first speaker of that session is Britta. So she has just accepted a position as assistant teaching professor at Penn State University, and she'll be talking today about invasive plant dispersal and climate change.
Good morning, everybody. So today it's early and everybody's getting going. So I'm going to start actually by revealing the bottom line of this presentation. So I'm going to try to convince you today that changes in climate are likely to exacerbate dispersal and spread in invasive species. But I'm also going to try to put this in the broader context, and I'm going to try to make a case too that the biological changes that happen inside a plant or an organism really due to warming temperatures or increases or decreases in precipitation, those are unlikely to become priorities for management action for two reasons. I think the effects, the results of what I'm about to show you are going to be pretty local, and it's unclear how management action would actually change if climate change made dispersal in organisms worse. And I'm going to make a case that it's much more important to just carry on doing the things that you're already doing. So I first want to start by talking about invasive species and dispersal. Unfortunately, dispersal is one of the most understudied topics in demography, period, much less in invasive species. And so invasive species are remarkable in this way, though. They have a large reproductive output, they have high fecundity, they often have great dispersal ability, and they're often phenotypically plastic. And so one of the things I wanted to show you is the main factors that contribute to wind dispersal. So I focus in particular on this case study, this species, it's an invasive plant species, mostly because there's just not that much research on other species. This is a case study species from the lab that I did my PhD in, and we just don't have a lot of evidence from other species. So in this particular species, we know that there's a strong relationship between the ultimate dispersal that a seed can travel, the height of the plant, and several other factors like the height of the surrounding vegetation, how quickly seeds fall through standing air. So if a seed falls slowly through standing air, we expect it to remain aloft for a longer time. So slower seeds are actually advantageous for wind dispersal. And then abiotic factors of the environment, like horizontal wind speed, just how fast the wind is blowing. You can imagine higher wind speeds carry seeds further, and turbulence. So updrafts can also cause seeds to lift off the ground and go further in higher wind speeds. And so once we have a handle on what traits and what factors of the environment we're interested in, we also want to find out how, in addition to these traits, how climate change could affect biological dispersal, so just the means by which the species can move through the environment in this wind-dispersed invasive species. And so if we focus in on those abiotic factors, the wind speed and turbulence, we know that climate change is going to affect these things. So in the last 30 years, we've been going through a period of what's called global stilling. So generally, wind speeds have decreased. Some people think this has to do with increase in surface roughness, which sort of, so more trees since the 1850s has reduced wind speed on land. But it's actually very difficult to model these things, and modelers prefer to model wind speed over seas. So they prefer to, so the models are poor. But we do expect to have an increase in turbulence, mostly because of the increase in extreme weather events. And so that could, in a sense, cause more wind-dispersed seeds or even wind-dispersed insects to remain aloft, to get higher into the air column and take faster wind speeds further distances. But for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on the biotic factors that are related to climate change. So the first thing that you'll see here is the height of seed release. So we know that warming and water are good things for plants. So if plants can get taller, it may exacerbate spread in these invasive species. And we also know that terminal velocity, if seeds could get bigger, if their big plumes could get larger, they might fall more slowly. So it's possible that in even seed release, the number of seeds that are released on a particular wind speed, those things could actually change under climate change. And the rest of the talk is devoted to finding out whether those things could be real challenges in the future. And so the first thing to review is the idea of phenotypic plasticity. So in terms of dispersal capacity, there are some species that produce fixed traits regardless of the environment that they're in. So they could just produce one, mean with a very small standard deviation of that trait. The plants are always sort of the same height. The plants always have the same dispersal traits. But there are also plants like the plant that I'm going to talk to you about today, which has plastic dispersal traits. So the same genotype in two different environments could produce two different dispersal traits, which could contribute to different dispersal distances among those different environmental conditions. And climate effects are one of those environmental conditions. So we want to know whether different climate effects could exacerbate or sort of make these invasive species more plastic, able to accommodate more environmental variability, or if it could actually work to our advantage and suppress the ability of these species to exist in heterogeneous environments. So the case study that I'm going to introduce you to here is Carduus nutans. It's an invasive species here in the United States. It's native to Eurasia. It's also invasive in Australia and New Zealand. And it produces these big, beautiful seeds that can remain in the air for a long time. Many undergraduates have chased these seeds long distances. And this has become mainly a forage pest. So it is an agricultural weed. It can invade intact prairie ecosystems where they exist, but it's usually on people's radars at that point. The main issue is that for this species is that it infects agricultural areas where they have cow grazing, which is a problem in Pennsylvania. So here you can see the cows have grazed pretty much everything except the thistles. This species is spread across North America, and I doubt all of these missing locations very seriously. I think this species has been in those areas. This map might be outdated, but this spread has occurred since 1880. Okay, so it's spread across the entire North American continent in a very short amount of time, which sort of makes this an attractive species to study for dispersal reasons. Like, did this species do it on its own, or was it humans, right? You guys already know the answer. I already told you the answer. So the cool thing about this species too is that we can measure all of these dispersal traits in the lab or in the field, as Molly's doing here. We can go out in the field and we can measure plant height. We can measure surrounding vegetation height. We can measure wind speed. We can measure turbulence. We can take seeds back to the lab and measure how quickly they fall through standing air. And if we're interested in how many seeds leave the flower head in a particular wind event, we can actually put those seeds in a wind tunnel, like this one in the Department of Aerospace Engineering, and actually quantify how many seeds leave the flower head at a particular moment in time. And once we've measured all of these factors, we can put them in mathematical models and try to predict how far a seed will travel on a given wind speed. So we can try to extrapolate out into the landscape how far these species will disperse. And when we know how many of them are moving, we can also get an idea of spread. So we can calculate a wave speed. So just like if you dropped a rock in a pond, you would see the waves move. We can do a similar mathematical exercise with this species, and many species also. And so what I'm gonna show you are some experimental results from the Shea Lab and some of my work that relate to whether this species, whether it's plastic or not, in a drought experiment, and then a warming experiment to try to find out how climate warming and increase in temperature might affect dispersal traits in this species. And at the end, I'm going to try to bring it all together and take some questions. So one of the first things that I thought of when I was trying to test dispersal in this plant is I was trying to make it shorter. Okay, how do we make this plant really suffer? And so I thought, oh, drought would be a great idea, except that I was in Pennsylvania and it's very wet. And so we had to use a high tunnel to exclude water from these plants. And so here's some pictures of the experimental process, call it that. So we actually planted already sprouted rosettes here in the field. can you actually see that I'm shaking that? Okay, great. We imposed 5 different levels of drought. We expected that this plant would be drought resilient, but we didn't realize how drought resilient it would be. The longest length of drought that this species could take in this high tunnel was about 18 days of no water, which was very impressive to me. There's me measuring the water content of the soils on a regular twice daily series. And then this is how big the plants got. And so once we had those plants, we actually measured the height of the plants, and then we also measured seed terminal velocity. And so what we found was we were right, like the drought can make these plants shorter, and that there was no effect on seed falling velocity. But we also saw that the number of healthy seeds was roughly the same, but the average seed mass was slightly lower in these drought-stressed plants, which, if we think carefully about the relationships between these traits, and if you ever want to study dispersal, definitely think carefully about the relationships between the traits. Seed mass is one of those factors that can make a seed fall more slowly if it's low, right? So I thought, well, maybe there's something more here. And I looked for a relationship between plant height and seed falling velocity. And ultimately, that's what we found. We found that under drought conditions, plants that can get tall fall more slowly. So there's actually a non-significant effect on terminal velocity, but overall there's this negative relationship between plant height and seed falling velocity, so that plants that are tall have more slowly falling seeds and can travel longer distances. So this red line is the drought treatment. The blue line, which represents no relationship with plant height, is the control treatment. And these contours represent the median dispersal distance. So these seeds over here are expected to travel longer distances than these plants, or the seeds from short plants that have fast falling seed terminal velocities and had heavier seed weights. So what we've shown here is that different environmental conditions can exacerbate spread. So under drought, if plants can get tall, we'd expect them to actually travel further given the same plant height. So here, the same plant height would travel a longer distance than a plant that was not drought stressed. So the next experiment that I want to tell you about is this open top chamber experiment, where we actually warmed the plants for their entire life cycle. So here you can see a picture of the open top chambers surrounding the plants out at Rock Springs and State College. So again, this is part of the invasive range, where there were two treatments, warming and ambient, and there were water addition treatments. And so my colleague Ray Zhang started this experiment by trying to examine whether plant height and seed falling velocity were affected by different warming treatments. And I added this component with the seed release in the wind tunnel. So what we did is we harvested flower heads here at what we call the paintbrush stage. We stored them in the lab until they were fully dry, and then we put them in the wind tunnel, and here you can see the flower head standing in front of these what we call horizontal threaded rods that create turbulence and the flat flow of the wind tunnel. And then we collected seeds on a screen at the other end. So we ran these experiments at different wind speeds at 5, 10, 15, and 20 meters per second. And at the end of those trials, we collected seeds between each speed. And what we found was plants that had grown in a warming treatment, and so the open top chambers imposed about a 0.5 degree Celsius increase in the temperature around the plants as they grew. If they grew under a warming condition, we found that the probability that a seed was released by the flower head was much higher in wind tunnel experiments. And we found that over the course of the experiment, you can see here that the warmed treatment released more seeds than under the ambient conditions. So these are Ray's results here on the left that show that the dispersal kernels, which show, like if you imagine that the peak of this is the furthest dispersal distance that you can go, which is about 1 meter, then the warmed experiment allowed you to go slightly further. And that created a difference in spread rate. So that wave speed that we saw, or that we can calculate, was about a 27% increase just due to the fact that plants were taller. when we add seed release dynamics, we find that the revised increase due to warming is actually closer to 40% increase in spread rate. So these are kind of scary numbers. So what we're saying here is that the factors that affect height, terminal velocity, and seed release can change the projected spread rates. That drought can increase the dispersal capacity of these species, and climate warming can also increase spread via two different mechanisms. So the increase in plant height and more seeds are being released on the wind. But I wanted to make sure that before I told you guys that these are things that should keep you awake at night, I wanted to put this in context. And so in the Shea Lab, we've done a variety of experiments on these, on this particular species. Everything from there's a white phenotype, anthocyanin negative, it lacks plant defenses against herbivores. There's a phenotype that we can use, and we've also looked at dispersal characteristics in that. We've looked at spatial spread in this species, and we've even looked at how different seeds vary across a single flower head. And I wanted to find out how big a change these climate effects were relative to everything else we've studied. So here's the plot that I'm going to show you that is the impact, the percent change in spread rate due to all the experiments that we've done. And on the y-axis here, I have an increasing scale of variation. So the results I'm going to show you under individual are differences between single seeds in the flower head. The phenotype experiment where we have differences in breeding, the management where we have biological control or not, whether adding nutrients changes the dispersal of this plant, and then the drought and the warming experiment that I showed you. And then I'm going to compare it to the overall change in spread rate due to simple changes in geography. So comparing this species in its native range to its invasive range. And as you can imagine, the simple transfer of this species from its native range to its invasive range increases spread by over 300%. Okay, that is by far and away, just the fact that it's invasive increases this species spread rate. And that dwarfs, in comparison, anything else we can impose on this species in the native range. So even if we summed up all of these other changes, let's imagine the worst case scenario where we have warming, drought, nutrients are slightly better, we have no weevils, no biological control. When we add all of that together, it's a 250% increase, okay, in the best case scenario, if it's additive. Now, so in extreme cases where it's more than additive, we may see this thing become doubly invasive, right? So it's going to be very difficult to recreate this 300% increase in seed dispersal or in spread rate, even under the best conditions. And I want to remind you that even though 600% increase in spread rate is a terrifying prospect, the take-home message here is that these thistles under climate change increased from 40 meters a year to 55 meters a year. That is barely the distance from me to the back of the room, okay? That sounds like a big number. And it's really like these species, across plant species, natural levels of plant spread are slow. So the fastest clocked we've ever estimated is about 146 meters a year. That's 1.5 soccer fields. That's not far. And recent research shows that North American tree species are expected to spread at slower than 300 to 500 meters per year. So those are very tall trees that are very adept at dispersal. That is not far. And also, in addition, current research is showing that demographic factors like fecundity, like the number of seeds that things are producing, are far more important for how often a species can establish in a different area than how far it can disperse. So getting back to the bottom line, I think that dispersal and phenotypic plasticity and invasive species are all very interesting, and I think that they're interesting biologically, but whether managers should lay awake at night worrying about this is something that I do not believe. And I think it is much more important to focus on human movement of invasive species, the prevention, the detection, and current management actions. And so I love my research, but you guys could have taken a nap. I want to thank everybody who is involved with this research, and with that, I'll take any questions.